Like Bob said, I really enjoy throwing parties. And when my kids were little, we threw some pretty fun ones. We lived in England when Dave was getting his doctorate in this large kind of apartment complex for international students and their families. And so I'm going to tell you this one party I threw was a Harry Potter party, because that was kind of all the rage. It made like really clever invitations, inviting people to the the Sorcerer's Cup thing, and but in Harry Potter they played Quidditch. But my husband was a doctoral student, and I worked for a nonprofit, and so we had no money. So I went out in the woods and gathered large sticks and little sticks, and I handmade 30 brooms. Tied them together with twigs so that we could play Quidditch. I had two older kids get those punching ball balloons that you can buy at the dollar store. Those were our bludgers, and they went around and whacked the kids that were playing Quidditch with them. I made big hoops and made them really bright so people could throw the quaffle through. I had the two older kids throwing this painted gold ping pong ball around so that they would try to catch this. The seekers could catch the snitch. In England they don't sell piñatas, but what's a party without a piñata? So I'm going to make a piñata. But if you're going to make a piñata, you don't make just why would you make a square or a circle if you could make Hogwarts Castle with spires and bridges, and then individually paint all the bricks, because the kids are going to really enjoy that as they whack it with a baseball bat. Right, and you don't the other thing is, because we lived in this complex with there were 200 families in it, which meant there were a lot of kids, and our party space was going to be outside. I felt a little bit I didn't want any kids to feel left out, so we basically just invited all the kids in the complex, which meant our parties had 40, 45 kids, because you also invited the friends from school. And so if you're going to make a birthday cake, it's got to feed 50. So if you're making it to feed 50 anyways, you might as well make it like a dragon. And so if you make a dragon cake, what do dragons do? They shoot fire. So you have to do your internet research on how do you make things flame. And so you make this little trough with, and I pour brandy in it. No brandy in the cake, but I pour brandy in it and then light it, and so the cake, the dragon can shoot fire out of its mouth, which was a really great idea. Except that it was in the daylight and you couldn't really see the fire, but the kids still loved it anyways, right? So my party's got a bit of a reputation. And so for this particular party, as the invitation went out, our friend Nate's friend Rowan's dad calls, and he's like, so Shannon and I got, Rowan's invitation. Do you need any help with that party? And I'm thinking, no, I don't need any help. I do parties. And then all of a sudden you realize, Dom wants to come. So I'm like, so Dom, how'd you like to be a potions master? Right? Okay, so I just told you a story. What did you learn about me and my family and our values from that story?
Party animals.
Okay, party animals. All right, yeah, we love to have fun. Yeah.
Nothing's too much trouble.
Okay, oh, that's great. You are so gracious. Nothing's too much trouble. Creative. Yeah. Community matters. Yeah, inclusive.
Your kids matter.
My kids matter, yeah. Yeah, I want to do something where they're seen as special, yeah.
You're an overachiever.
I was waiting for someone to say that, right? A little over the top. I was expecting crazy, actually, yeah. Yeah.
He was going to say crazy.
You are? Okay, good. Well, come on. This is a place of vulnerability. You just let it out, right? Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Anything else? I have a very supportive husband.
Yeah.
Who also thinks this is maybe a little over the top, but it's go ahead, right? Okay.
Economical?
Okay, economical, right. Can do a lot with very little. Yeah. Cool. We're going to talk about one of the Christmas passages this morning. And I was thinking about, so any of you all pastors? You preach? No pastors here. Okay. But I was just thinking in empathy. Okay, maybe a little. In empathy for our pastors, right? There's 4 Christmas passages. Maybe 5 or 6 if you go to the Old Testament. And they got to preach on them every year, right? And make it different, right? So, but I was kind of up for the challenge, and I was thinking, let's look at one of those Christmas passages that might be just like a little weird. And when pastors are preaching a sermon on it, and they've got seekers, and it's, you're going to share the gospel, you don't really get time to press into the weird. So I want us to press into the weird, because I think the weird is really interesting. So would somebody be willing to read Matthew 2, 1 to 12? It's on your pages. You're just going to hear my voice a lot, so I'd rather hear yours.
Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. He called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law and asked, "Where is the Messiah supposed to be born?" "In Bethlehem of Judea," they said, "for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you. Who will be the shepherd for my people Israel?" Then Herod called for a private meeting of the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. He told them, "Go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child. And when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him too." After this interview, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. When it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod.
So Jesus, would you help us hear you, meet you in a really familiar passage this morning? Help us to, thank you. Help us to, welcome you and see you a little bit more for who you are. In your name, amen. All right, so I'm going to talk us through just a couple interesting points in the passage, and then I'm going to give you guys a question to discuss, and then we'll work out of that. All right, so here's a couple things. The beginning passage, you'll notice that the word king and Messiah get used. It's sort of, because Messiah it is kind of an echo of king. It gets used 4 times. This sets up the sense that this is a passage, this is a story where there's going to be a conflict of kingdoms, right? And the kingdoms respond to the message of Jesus coming very, very differently, right? So you have king. Oh, so here's the thing: when a new king comes, I think we think of it as like, oh, there's a new king, hooray! But the thing is, there's already a kingdom there. So a new king coming isn't just heralded, unless it's like the lovely birth of a first son. A new king coming isn't heralded with joy. And you'll notice that in the text, that Herod, when he hears the news of the Magi coming, he was greatly disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. I don't know if you noticed that in verse 3. Herod is deeply disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Which, you think like, this is Christmas, it's Jesus, everybody should be happy. But it's not. And when as Herod is, he's not a very nice king. In fact, he's not really supposed to be king anyways. He's actually an Edomite. His mom was from Arabia. And so he's kind of a half-Jew. He was put in place by Rome. He's pretty threatened by any rivalry, any uprisings. He deals with them very violently and cruelly. So this news, when it comes, is not received with joy. And it actually, when I'm reading commentaries, it's like, the Magi probably came with a fairly large entourage, and they come up to the palace. Everybody's going to know that this happened, and nobody's going to be happy that Herod feels threatened. Because what are the repercussions of that going to be? Which we actually see later in the chapter. So new kings coming isn't necessarily good news. And that's one of the things that one of the tensions that the passage lays out for us is, how do you respond to this? It's interesting, Herod, when these wise men come, calls together a meeting of kind of his rulers, his teachers of the law, which is really an echo of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2. When Nebuchadnezzar has a dream and he calls together his rulers and advisors to help him, right? Which is not necessarily like a comparison if you're a Jewish king that you want made with you, right? So he calls these people together to find out more information. But everyone kind of knows, but the key thing is, how do they respond? Do they respond with curiosity, interest, with defensiveness, or apathy? It's intriguing that we hear nothing, even these wise men or these religious leaders who know their scriptures so well. The only people who move on and go to that manger are the wise men. Interesting. So what prompts this is a star. And it's interesting because here, like, a lot of people have done a lot of research to say, what is this star? And there's a number of possibilities. So Herod died in 4 BC. So our dating of Christmas is probably not 0. I'm sorry to shatter that image. And Jesus is born before Herod dies. But there are some really interesting star things that show up in the sky. In BC sort of 1211, Halley's Comet comes through, right? This moving thing that shows up out of nowhere. In BC 7, there's a Saturn and Jupiter overlap, and when you see stars do that, they get really bright. That happens in the constellation of Pisces, which is the constellation kind of the West, and at the end of the year, sort of end times, right? So that could be it. In 5/4, so much closer to Herod's death, there's a supernova that happens. And the reason we know this is that Chinese astrologers or astronomers saw it and recorded it, right? So this is a very visible thing that was noted all through the East. So it could have been any of these things. But these wise men notice and respond. So I just want to ask, there's this word that you use when people look in the stars and notice things, things rising and decide what's going to happen in the future by it. There's a word for that. Okay, astrology, right. So these wise men kind of are seem like they're practicing astrology, which is interesting. Who the wise men are, we don't really know. This is why this is one of those weird passages, because they kind of show up and then they just disappear, and it's pretty vague, right? So the word that here is translated wise men is magos in Greek. Sorry. I just want to say, I work with college students. This 6:30 in the morning thing, I didn't even know it existed, right? So the coffee hasn't fully kicked in yet. And when it does, I'm going to talk even faster. But magos is used to refer to maybe a Persian priestly class. The Persians were very into their astrology. And in fact, the word magus, which is related to this, means powerful. It can be used of people who possess supernatural power or magicians. It also references deceivers and seducers. So it's not necessarily a word that comes with positive connotations. There's an idea that, there's that song, right? We three, right? If you ever really want to get my husband going, ask him how many kings there are. We won't go there. But the idea that they're kings, the word magos and who they are is probably not kings. They're probably advisors to kings. The reason that kings thing gets called up is in both Psalm 72 and Isaiah 60. Kings from the nations come and offer gifts to the Messiah. And so people are like, oh, right, this has to be those kings. Maybe it's just sort of a powerful people, right? Or maybe that's more of a, in the second coming, kings will actually bow before him, right? I say in Philippians 2. So they're probably not kings. They're probably wise advisors to rulers. They're from the east, which is, again, like really clear, right? I mean, there's a lot of east. So where are they from? We don't know. People guess, though, right? So the gifts, all those gifts come from Arabia. But they don't have to be from Arabia because there's trade routes, right? So they might be from Babylon. And one of the reasons people think this is if they're looking for the king of the Jews, that might be a messianic term. So they might have heard stories of a Messiah, and they're kind of looking to come. Most likely, I think they're Persians, because Persians were really, really into astrology. But we don't know. There's a strain of thought that says, oh, they're Jews from the diaspora that have been looking for the Messiah and coming, which would be really cool, except it's not likely. They don't know the Micah 5 passage that says that the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem, and so they go to the wrong place. And if they were Jews, they would probably know that Herod is not a nice king. And also, the second and more convincing thing to me is that they're using astrology, right? So it's not likely they're Jewish. It's likely that they're Babylonian or Persian, and they have traveled a very long way. So they go to Jerusalem, which would be, again, if you don't know when a king is born, you're going to expect him to be born in the palace, right? So they go there, stir up a great kerfuffle. Herod calls together his kind of his own wise men to ask for sure, where is this going to happen? And they quote both Micah 5, or Matthew retells it, as them sort of mixing together Matthew 5 and 2 Samuel 5. Micah 5, sorry. So Micah 5 is a prediction of when the Messiah will come and where, and he will be a mighty ruler with majesty, strength. He'll be a fortress for the people. In 2 Samuel 5, that's at David's coronation, and a lot of these same themes come up, but the second half, that he will be a shepherd for my people Israel, comes from there. And so Matthew is pulling together both a messianic and a Davidic thing and pulling them together. But it's interesting that rather than emphasizing the mighty ruler, he emphasizes the shepherd for his people. Herod calls the wise men back and basically creates this little plot, right, to find out. Okay, so I know where, now tell me when, and then come back and tell me, right? So the really ironic thing is, remember that the Magi, that word, can mean seducer or deceiver. In this passage, it's actually the king of Israel, or the governor of Israel, right? That is the seducer, deceiver. Where the Magi operate in transparency and curiosity and honesty. So the wise men go, and then they follow this star, right? So at the top you go, oh, right, this is a clear astronomical event, right? There's a star. It happened in 11, 7, or 5 BC. Now in verse 9, the star sort of moves. And Bethlehem is about 5 miles from Jerusalem. So if you're talking stars that are like way up in the sky, there's like, it can move a long way and it will not tell you anything, right? So now we're talking about something a little bit more intimate, miraculous. It kind of references like when God is guiding the Israelites, and he goes before them in that pillar of fire or cloud. Right? There's this sort of a tender guiding, but nobody knows what this is, right? But it seems like there's something very God-inspired and directing that's happened. When they come into the place where the child was, I love this, they were filled with joy. Okay, that's from my reading, again, I don't speak Greek, I read commentaries. But from my reading, that's a rather lame translation. True, but the Greek there is apparently really awkward and weird. And it's like they rejoiced with an exceedingly great joy, exceedingly. Right? Like it's just this sort of over the top, keep repeating that word. And one of the commentators said, they were thrilled to bits. Again, contrast that with Herod's response. Of being threatened, leading to violence. Contrast that with the religious leaders who know it all, and we never hear of them responding. Right? These guys are exceedingly glad. They give the child gift, which echoes when the Queen of Sheba comes and gives gifts to Solomon. And that gift list is actually kind of similar. God again intervenes, warns them. Astrologers and wise men and magi are also people who respond to dreams, and they leave. Okay? So we've kind of talked through some of the bits of the passage. What I would love for you, let me raise the tension. These guys, again, your word, seem like they might be astrologers. Astrology is not generally looked on positively in the Bible, right? So in Deuteronomy 18, God says, or through Moses, when you enter the land of the Lord your God is giving you, be very careful not to imitate the detestable customs of the nations living there. For example, never sacrifice your son or daughter as a burnt offering. Okay, got that one. Do not let your people practice fortune telling, use sorcery, or interpret omens, and that would be where the astrology catches in, or engage in witchcraft or casting spells, or function as mediums or psychics, or call forth the spirits of the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. Right? In Isaiah 47, this is a passage where God is kind of mocking the futility of idolatry. He says, all of the advice you received has made you tired. Where are your astrologers, those stargazers who made predictions each month? Let them stand up and save you from what the future holds. But they are like straw burning in a fire. They can't save themselves from the flame. You will get no help from them at all. Their hearth is no place to sit for warmth. And unless you think it's just sort of a long ago Old Testament thing, Paul holds these values very deeply. So in Acts 13, they travel to Paphos. They meet a Jewish sorcerer, a false prophet named Bar-Jesus. Saul, also known as Paul, was filled with the Holy Spirit and looked the sorcerer in the eye. And then he said, "You son of the devil, full of every sort of deceit, fraud, and enemy of all that is good, will you never stop perverting the true ways of the Lord?" So here's my question to you. What's the significance of the fact that God uses astrology that is detestable to him to send this message out? So this is what I want you to talk about. What does the nature of the message and the target audience tell you about the sender? Right? Like he's thought about, like, what does my party tell you about me? What is this tell you about God. And it's complicated, right? Because God forbids this stuff, says people who practice it are detestable. And yet it's recorded without judgment in the narrative that announces Jesus is coming. So how's that for a wake your brain up question? So talk about it. I'm going to give you guys like 7-8 minutes to talk. And then if you have some time, talk a little bit about what the implications are for us. Okay? All right, let me pull us together. And my view of this next section is, rather than it's me talking, it's you share, like we're just going to expand that conversation to fill the room. And so I'd love to hear some of the things that you guys were talking about, what this says about God, like what this story tells you about him. And pretend you're the second comment, so we just skip that awkward first pause.
I was impressed that the motivations for the wise guys was life-changing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not every day that a bunch of guys get together and say, hey, I think something unique is happening.
Yeah, that hundreds of miles away.
Let's take a road trip next Tuesday, and we're going to go exploring. They had the privilege of enough education to study culture, religious views, and been exposed to different points of view. They had the freedom to go deep. They had the privileged position of being able to afford to travel. There's a lot of things that happen here.
Yeah, right. So if you couldn't hear, there's a sense of like, it's really amazing how these guys respond, right? In the sense of like, they pull together, they do this road trip, which is going to be incredibly expensive, but also some reference to the fact that these are educated, privileged people who can do this, who have the time to reflect on the stars, who can just at a moment's notice leave their job for probably months. It's kind of an amazing response. Like you see a bright star and you go, hey, let's go on a road trip on camels across the desert to somewhere we don't even know where we're going. Wow, that has echoes of biblical themes, doesn't it? Yeah, sir.
I don't know what the percentage is, but of all the non-believers out there, a large percentage of them that are still seeking the truth. And I think that's what these guys were doing. They weren't necessarily people of God at this time, but they're still trying to figure it out.
Wow. Did anybody else get goosebumps? That's such an amazing moment, right? Like, because there's this acknowledgement, and if I pull it back to the God thing, like there's an acknowledgement, there are people who are seeking truth, just not in ways that those of us who are religious would maybe acknowledge us the right way or see. But God seems to say, there are people out there seeking truth, and if you're looking to the stars for truth, I'll give you astrology, right? Because I want you to have a chance.
The miraculous nature of God.
Okay, yeah, so this is this miraculous nature, but some of the miraculous nature is, I want to reach astrologers in Persia or Babylon, and I'm going to speak their language. Even though in my Bible, I say this is a detestable practice, right? Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Foreshadows the Jews and the Gentiles.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
looking ahead to what we will learn more about.
Absolutely, right? Like, so Matthew, like right at the beginning, brings those Gentiles in. And says, these people are responsive, right? These people are seeking truth. Do not box them in. Do not write them out as other people. These people are seeking truth more than your own religious leaders. Yeah.
They were, and the Jewish people had been dispersed several times. So there were stories, Seminary, across many cultures.
Sure.
And the fact is that God raised up these guys as kids with curiosity,
with initiative,
Okay.
with the ability to appreciate others, with the ability to say, to a spirit of adventure. And they were raised for such a time as this.
Okay, all right. So, yeah, so these guys have, again, that adventure, that spirit of curiosity, that, and our brothers talking about, like, God gave them that, right? They have that capacity. Yeah. I overheard somebody else talking in the room about, like, how God just puts this out there for anybody. Is anybody looking? But these guys are, right? It's a completely inclusive thing. You can see it. But these guys have the skills and the knowledge and the cultural upbringing to understand it. Yeah. Which is just, it's so funny because, like, you think about the Christmas narrative and you think about the, in Luke, the angels, like, I love that story. Like, so the angel's talking, and before he even finishes, the ghost bursts in and starts singing, right? It's like, oh, come on, get over it. We just got to announce that Jesus is born, right? Like, we just got to sing. This feels to me like that in a little bit more scholarly, Gentile thing. Like, God's like, I can't keep this in. This is such good news. People in Persia need to see it. Astrologers need to see it.
What you're saying is they were able to read the signs of the times.
Yeah.
And nobody else was looking for the signs of the times.
Right. Yeah. So you keep focusing on who the Magi is, and I want to focus on who God is. So, which is fine, and because I think both of those things are there, right? Like, so these guys are responsive, but we also follow a God who communicates in the language of these guys, even though to his own people, that's anathema, right? That he is willing to speak the language of pagan Gentiles in order to communicate, right? And then I think, again, like this table is saying, and like our brother said, there are people out there who are seeking the truth. They're just looking in weird places. But that doesn't seem to bother God. I mean, he wants them to find his truth, right? Like, so in that way it bothers him. But he's like, I'll jump in there in order to communicate. So here's my question. Our mission is to follow Jesus into the world, right? So God goes, and I'm going to say this provocatively, but God seems to be willing to break his own rules in order to reach people. As we follow Jesus into the world, what are the implications for us? That's what I'm asking. Well, right, because this is one of those missiological principles, right? To what degree do we follow and imitate, and what degree is this just God's prerogative, right? Like, so this is, I'm not saying, should we become astrologers? No, because we're not trying to model ourselves after the Magi. But do we jump into those places, and communicate in the language of the people, even though it's language that in our comfort zones, we're not comfortable with? How's that for cleverly phrased?
Are we willing to break the rules of the bubble we live in?
There you go. Are we willing to break the rules of the bubble we live in to reach people who might be seeking truth in unconventional ways? Right? Yes.
See it as God breaking his own rules. I see it as using a humanity that is damaged. I mean,
Beautiful.
he used Judas. He allowed Herod to kill lots of babies. Like there's all kinds of brokenness. And I see it more as using a broken people to, which we all are, and that we can bring our brokenness into the world to help others around us.
Right?
Those are the rules we've imputed to God that he didn't make up for us.
Well, and isn't it interesting that when Jesus comes, he's constantly being boxed in by the bubble, the cultural expectations, and Jesus is constantly, no, I'm going to go ahead and touch this leper. No, I'm going to eat with these tax collectors and sinners, right? No, I'm going It's okay if you harvest a little grain with your hand on the Sabbath. It's okay if I heal people on this. Because the message is God loves these people. And was he breaking the law? No, not technically, but he was certainly breaking the bubble. And it's interesting that in the announcement of Jesus himself, God breaks the bubble. Right? And so I want us to think, who are the out there pagans that we would never think are interested? Who are the people that getting close to might mean we do some stuff that we feel a little uncomfortable with? It might not feel very Christian and like, what would our pastor say? In order to love and let them see a message in a language that they can understand. What does it mean that we have a God who is so excited about sending Jesus into the world that he reaches out to astrologers using astrology? Right? Because like our brother said, people are seeking truth and God is seeking them. And I guess the question for us is, are we going to follow him? So I just want to take a moment and pray. So Jesus, there's a way in which I really love the wow, that's tense and makes me think passages. And yet as they get a little closer in, I don't really love them because I kind of like being comfortable. But ultimately, I want to follow you into the world. I want to be lined up with you who loves Persian or Babylonian astrologers, who touches lepers, who breaks the bubble. So God, would you help us in this season to truly worship a God who doesn't just love us, but loves the world? And would you keep our eyes and our hearts open, and would you give us courage to reach out? Because we don't know who's seeking you and who will respond. This passage is full of surprises. Would you give us that sense of adventure as we enter this season and welcome you? I pray this in your name. Amen.